All right, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this, our first event in our brand new series, Spotting Bullshit. These days we see a lot in the media, a lot of opinions, a lot of facts, some facts which may not be facts at all. And in order to give you the tools to spot the dodgy reasoning when you encounter it, we kick off the series with a crash course in logic and logical fallacies. Before we start, I'd like to thank you for all observing the proper social distancing. You all have your lunch, I see, so enjoy. Also, after the event, we will ask you to leave one row at a time so that we can observe social distancing at all times. Also, I may as well explain this now. At the end of the event, there'll be a bit of time for asking questions. Also, in order to keep that hygienic, I will come to you if you have a question. You can tell me the question, and I'll repeat it into the microphone, also for our viewers at home. We also have a little bit of interaction through Menti. There'll be a few polls and also opportunity for people at home to ask questions at the end, either in the YouTube chat or through our Menti page. Presumably this is also on your screens at home. You can maybe blow up the slides for a little bit. If you go to menti.com and enter that code, we will be able to ask you questions later, and you'll be able to ask your questions to us. Then, without further ado, I would like to welcome our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Rosa Runhardt from Leiden University. Take it away. Enjoy.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Lester, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming here, despite what I've heard is a bit of an outbreak in Delft at the moment amongst the students. Today, I want to talk to you about mistakes in reasoning, and I want to do that as broadly as possible. So I want to talk to you about mistakes in patterns of reasoning, mistakes that we normally call logical fallacies. I want to talk to you about mistakes in the basis for which someone is drawing a conclusion. In other words, mistakes in premises. And I want to talk to you about social facts. Social facts are going to be important to me mainly because I work as a philosopher of social science. And so this is going to be, let's say, the latter third of this talk. Why logic? Why was I asked to do this in the first place? At the root, logic is meant for us to test the patterns of our reasoning. Very simply put, what we are interested in is improving the patterns with which we speak and think, but it is also meant to evaluate others' arguments. For example, when you see a politician make a particular speech, as we will in a few moments, you can test the patterns in their reasoning and see whether or not this is something that appeals to you or whether you think you've spotted a flaw. The spotting of mistakes in reasoning will take about half of our talk, and I'll let you spot some mistakes in reasoning as well, so hopefully you can interact with that. So please also don't hesitate to do that at home, although I'll be taking some answers from the audience. All right, so let's start with mistakes in patterns. What kinds of patterns do we expect our reasoning to have? Like I said, I'm going to focus here on arguments which consist of some kind of conclusion, the thing that we are trying to convince others of, as well as premises which are meant as the evidence, as the support for our conclusion. So that's how I will broadly construe arguments, and such arguments have patterns. Let's go to a good example of a pattern in reasoning which I think you will all recognize as fallacious. So, if we could start with Mr. Trump here. Please see if you can spot the flaw in their reasoning.
I just want to get you to clarify, because it's a very important point. Can you say definitively that nobody on your campaign had any contacts with the Russians during the campaign? And on the leaks, is it fake news or are these real leaks?
Well, the leaks are real. You're the one that wrote about them and reported them. I mean, the leaks are real. You know what they said, you saw it. And the leaks are absolutely real. The news is fake. because so much of the news is fake. So one
All right,
thing,
thank you. So the news is fake because the news is fake. Great. He is trying to convince us of a conclusion, which is news is fake, and he is using a very solid piece of evidence for that, namely that news is fake. All right, what is this? This is begging the question. And of course here, Mr. Trump has very graciously given us a good example of a very simple begging the question, but this can take all kinds of shapes. What are we doing here? We've got a premise, a bit of evidence or a bit of reasoning which is going to support a conclusion. Let's call that A, and conclude from that after the therefore in our conclusion that A is true. Right. Why do we know that this is a mistaken reasoning? Because it might well be that the news is not fake. In which case, of course, the conclusion would be false as well. Very simple format. And we can see in other people's reasoning that this occurs all the time. It might be that they are trying to hide this premise. They are trying to hide this reasoning behind the conclusion by adding all kinds of other premises. But somehow, if there is hidden in the premises, hidden in the reasoning behind the conclusion itself, we call this begging the question. And of course, you can spot this all over the place in certain people's arguments. All right. Here's another one, which I'm sure you've all encountered, maybe even thought yourselves intuitively. I certainly have, so we're, not immune to these mistakes. Our brains love this one. If I have COVID-19, then I have a cough. I have a cough, therefore I have COVID-19, right? And in our most paranoid moments, we've all thought this. We all know that this is mistaken if we thought about it rationally. And why, I would argue, we know that this is a mistake is because of the pattern. What is the pattern here? We have if A then B, if the antecedent then the consequent therefore the antecedent. So we are concluding from the then that the if must be true as well. This is affirming the consequent. We know that this is mistaken because we could fill in all kinds of other A's and B's in this pattern and get completely mistaken arguments. Why are they mistaken? Because the premises will be true and the conclusion will be false. There have been moments that I've coughed in the past. I also know that, give or take a few exceptions, if I have COVID-19, then I will have a cough. Yet, so far, I don't think I've got it, right? So there we have true premises and a false conclusion, which means that this argument is fallacious. All right. Another one in pop songs. If I were rich, I could be happy. I'm not rich, therefore I cannot be happy. Alas, right? Very simple. If A, then B. Not A, therefore not B. And again, we can fill in all kinds of A's and B's here and see that these lead to true premises and a false conclusion, which means that there must be something wrong in the pattern of our reasoning. All right, denying the antecedent. Right, the antecedent here is our start of the if-then statement. I were rich. And by denying that, we think that we've also denied the consequent. We don't know that this is the case. All right. So why do we study logic? And for some of you, this is a requirement, right? I know that there are some people in the live stream who have to take logic as part of their education. For others, it's merely an interest in trying to uncover alternative facts or fake news or something of the sort. Why do I do it? Well, in my everyday life, I know that I have difficulty sometimes processing complicated statements consisting of, say, an if-then statement and a couple of propositions. Here, propositions means simply that a sentence is true or false, right? And nothing in between. I know that when I combine propositions, as I've done in the previous slide, as Mr. Trump has done in his little talk, when I combine these in more complicated ways, sometimes my brain can't spot the mistake at once. So why do we focus on the pattern? Because the pattern will allow us to go from one case where we have difficulty interpreting an argument to another place where we are familiar with the structure already, right? So we're trying to uncover the structure of someone's reasoning to then import into this structure of reasoning an example that's familiar to us. All right. That's quite abstract, so let's have a look at an example. This is a very simple experiment which has been held in many different forms. Subjects in this experiment are given 4 cards. I've labeled them here. 2 of them are facing up and have a letter on them, R and E. The other, number 3 and 4, are facing down and have a number on them, 7 and 2. These subjects are told that each of these cards will have a letter on one side and a number on the other. Fair enough. Now, we want to test the hypothesis, that's what we tell our subjects, that if there is a vowel on one side of the card, there will be an odd number on the other, right? Very simple. And the subjects are asked, which cards do you want me to flip to check whether this is true? Very simple. Okay. Now, the question is, which cards would you, if you were a subject in this piece of research, turn over to see if any break this rule? And if you find this very simple, then please ask yourselves, what do you think the most common mistake is? Because that in itself is very telling about how our brains process propositional reasoning. All right. Let's have a look at your answers, especially people at home. Of course, I don't know who you are. Let's see how you are answering this question. I'm hoping you will be better at this, seeing as you are at a talk about logical fallacies, than the average Joe, and I will give you an example of how they reason about this as well. All right.
So we'll just leave the code on the screen for a few seconds longer, and then we'll go to the live results.
Of course, voting is completely anonymous. All right, there we go. Very interesting, and people were able to, I believe, click 2 answers, is that right?
Yes, multiple answers are indeed possible.
Perfect. All right. Here we have it. This is very interesting. I like that we actually do get people voting for R as well. That almost never happens, which gives you a little bit of a hint into that being a wrong choice. So the question was, which of these cards do you turn over, right? Let's have a look at, before we give away the answer, what another way to approach this pattern in reasoning is, right? And I'll promise you this one's easier. Okay, let's go to the next. Ooh, could we go back to the slide for a second? So I can explain this particular question. Thank you. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Same setup. You've got a group of research subjects. You ask them, there are 4 people in a pub. And for our benefit, I've labeled them as cards. But of course, you can think of an actual pub before COVID. 1 person is drinking water. 1 person is drinking beer. 1 person is an adult. And 1 person is obviously a child because they're holding this little balloon, right? Okay, so we know about these people, very straightforward, that they will be either underage or, allowed to drink. This is a situation in the Netherlands, right? So we're allowed to drink over 18. We want to enforce the law, as everyone knows, that if you're having a beer, you must be 18 or over. So we go to the pub, we are checking these people out, and we're asking, the right questions. Who do we go to? In this scenario, where 1 person is drinking water, we don't know their age. 1 person is drinking beer, we don't know their age. 1 person is an adult, we don't know what they're drinking. And 1 person is obviously a child holding a small balloon and is drinking a beverage that we don't know about. Who are we going to check? Who are we going to investigate to see if this law is broken? Let's go to the voting page. Very nice. All right. I'm going to leave this for a little while longer to see if we get some more results. And please don't forget that you are allowed to vote on more than 1 option, right? You might want to check more than 1 person in this pub. I'm very pleased to see that so many people are going to approach the person who is drinking a beer. I'm saddened to see that not that many people are asking the child what the child is drinking. This could be anything, right? We don't know that. But all right, let's keep it at that. Thank you very much. Let's have a look at the results in general, right? So what do people say? We've seen that when there is a more abstract pattern that we are trying to test, here it's if there's a vowel on one side, there's an odd number on the other, which card do we turn over? People go for the E and for the number 7, which is an odd number. And in the case of the beer and the water, we are faced with this answer. The pattern is the same, yet the answer is completely different. That is wrong. This means that someone somewhere has made a mistake in reasoning. Let's have a look at my slides again. So we can go to what people normally say. All right. So we were faced with this scenario. We tested it. I hope that you can see that you need to talk to the person drinking the beer and to the small child, right? If the child is drinking beer, then that is breaking the law. If the person drinking the beer is a child, then we also know they are breaking the law. All right. It doesn't matter how old the person who's drinking water is. It doesn't matter whether this person, this adult, our number 3, is drinking water or beer. Nothing in our law says, and I hope you realize this, that adults can only drink beer, right? Otherwise, I don't think I would be allowed my cappuccino here, right? So this is the mistake. All right. There is, in pattern, no difference between the pub situation and the number and letter situation. So anyone who's answered something differently for the numbers and the letters than they have for the pub situation might be the right kind of person for this talk, the right kind of person in my audience, and from now on would have to check their patterns of reasoning a little bit more. All right. Now, don't fear, I've got the pattern right here. This is what is being tested. If A, then B is equivalent, is the same thing as if not B, then not A. Very simple scenario. If you are drinking beer, then you must be over 18. The opposite is true. If you're under 18, then you cannot be drinking the beer, right? We know this. This is very simple. We've got this in our brains, whether by exposure, whether by some kind of other pattern in our brain that just helps us deal with these kinds of reasoning when it is more familiar to us. If you want to know more about this, I recommend the book The Playful Brain by Restak and Kim, who have given you more detail, the actual social scientific background to this mistaken reasoning. All right, so the results of voting we've already seen. So which card did we have to turn over here? If we turn over the letter E and we find out that there isn't an odd number on the other side, then we have a mistake, right? And most people realize this. However, when we turn over the 7 and see a vowel or consonant on the other side, doesn't matter. That is like asking the adult whether they are drinking water or beer. No one cares. That's not part of this reasoning. What we are interested in is the 2. The 2 here is our little child. We want to see whether on the other side of the 2 there is a consonant or a vowel. Because if there is a vowel on the other side, we know that the law has been broken. Because then, if there is a vowel on one side, there isn't an odd number on the other, right? And of course, a lot of people get this wrong, right? 25% of people get this right in the first instance that they test this. More interestingly, over 90% of subjects get the second one right. This is the same problem. So, what does this tell you about patterns? This tells you that patterns are important and that we, as humans, are much better at recognizing patterns and testing patterns when these are familiar to us. So what I intend for you to do after this talk, one of the takeaway points will be to go home, listen to the news and see if you can spot the patterns in the reasoning. All right. But of course, patterns aren't the only part to someone's argument. There are also bad facts, right? By which I mean that sometimes reasoning is based on premises, on evidence, for instance, that's false in itself. So let's have a look at some examples of that. I like this one here. So Mr. Donald Trump, who's been our example before, argues here, so the media likes to say we have the most cases of COVID-19 in the United States, but we do by far the most testing. If we did very little testing, we wouldn't have the most cases. Right? Lovely, lovely, right. What is the fallacy here? What do you think? Even if you don't know the name to it, I would like to know what you think is going wrong in this argument here. What is the fallacy? And I've been told that you are going to be able to give us a written answer. So let's see, and I believe that the YouTube people can interact with this as well, so looking forward to that. Let's have a look. What is the fallacy? What is going wrong here on that slide? Yeah, nice. Some good answers here. I'll read some of them out in a little bit because I've seen such answers before. Let's give it a few more moments. I'll have my drink in the meantime. My not a beer. Do we have any other results? I like that there's emoticons in this. I didn't know that was possible. Perfect. All right. Test scores cases. I think that's a really good summary of what we're doing here. Amount of testing is not the only thing influencing the amount of cases. Perfect. All right. Good. Good. So this is what I anticipated people would say. I like it. Let's go back to the slides and see what's going on there. All right. So the common answer is something along the lines of, dear Mr. Trump, these tests don't cause COVID. All right. Okay. So a lot of people think it's something like correlation does not equal causation. The number of tests is correlated to the number of the cases in the United States, but it's not the case that testing causes COVID. All right. Now, that is not the mistaken reasoning here at all. Let's have a look at what the mistaken reasoning is. It's an ad hominem fallacy. Right? Everyone here reading that quote thought to themselves, it's Trump, so it must be wrong. It's Trump, so it must be a mistaken reasoning, right? He must be mistaking correlation for causation. All right. Now, let's continue the rest of this interview, which you can find in Business Insider. For instance, they would say, and this is Mr. Trump again, we have more cases than China. I don't think so. We have more than other countries. I don't think so. But by doing all of the testing, we're going to have more cases because we do more testing. Otherwise, you don't know if you have a case. Right? See, he does understand. He does know what's going on. And everyone here thought, you know, based on that little snippet, that they knew what was going wrong. And that is a mistaken reasoning in itself. Right? So what is the mistake here in the premise? The premise was, if it's Trump, it must be fallacious. And that is not true. All right. So we have two kinds of bad arguments. One is a mistaken patterns, as we've seen. Right? You look at a pattern and the pattern somehow is misleading to you. You don't spot the mistake in the pattern. You, for instance, think that if A, then B is the same as if not A, then not B, which is behind what was going wrong in our card example. But there's also such a thing as mistaken premises, the mistake in the foundation behind someone's conclusion, right? Now, in the philosophical account of logic, we call this the distinction between validity and soundness, right? And for those of you who've studied logic, this will be familiar. Validity only means that our pattern works. Validity does not mean that the premises, the basis of our reasoning, is also true. For that, we need more, right? So we need to make a distinction here between bad patterns, which would make an argument invalid, and unsound arguments where the premises are wrong. All right? Okay. So here's another lovely example of a mistake in our reasoning. Think of UK businessmen's claims. Here it's Luke Johnson, the head of Patisserie Valerie in the UK, saying something like, as an entrepreneur, I know that Britain would thrive out of the EU. All right? Okay, so what is the mistake there? Here the mistake is that a person thinks that them saying it is the same as proof, right? I am a businessman, surely everything I say will be true, right? And we know that this is something that occurs a lot. I just wanted to highlight this because of the lovely name, which I think is aptly called the self-trumpeter's fallacy. Love it. All right, here's another one. Argument from ignorance, right? Since we cannot prove with absolute certainty that a claim is true, it must be false. All right, so let's let that sink in. Let's have a look at an example of how this would occur in real life. Here's one. Scientists are never going to be able to positively prove the crazy theory that humans evolved from other creatures because we weren't there to see it. Right? Okay, that's a mistake in itself. I'm sure that the natural scientists and the engineers in the audience can spot where the mistake is there. So that proves the Genesis 6-day creation account is literally true as written. And why is this also a mistake? Well, even if the first thing were true, right? Even if you were so skeptical that you thought that if you weren't there to see it, it can't be true, right? It's not the same thing as saying that the opposite is automatically the case. So here we are dealing also with a false dilemma, right? Where we're saying either this account of evolution is the right account of evolution or Genesis, right? That's the only two options. We are also trying to say that the only reasonable source of evidence is our observation, our direct observation. We are saying a lot of things here that are not true. So you can see here it's a really nice compounded problem where we are heaping fallacy upon fallacy upon fallacy. Okay. Now in this case, we start thinking a little bit more about what kind of evidence people can give for scientific theories. And because we are dealing here with logical reasoning in real life, and particularly in the news, in your referenda, in your accounts of the elections in the US, etc., in your reasoning about COVID, we are starting to think about what actually works in social science and what doesn't. Right? A lot of you will be very critical in thinking about their own area of research. You'll be able to think about natural science, about engineering, and think about, okay, what works in my experiments and what doesn't. Right. But what about the social facts? Because whether or not you think that social science is actually science, you will be basing some of your reasoning on things you think are facts about the social world. Right? Whether they are simple statements about the economy, like a person I overheard in the bus on my way here saying something along the lines of, well, the house market is crashing, obviously. And this friend said, why? And he said, because it was in the news. And I thought, okay, great. So there, this person who might be very critical of social science as a general enterprise still bases their faith not only on the news, but also on some kind of social fact, right? Someone somewhere has made this argument based on an attempted scientific reasoning. So social facts, how do we get them? And this is going to be the last part of my talk, so I'm going to highlight to you 3 general rules with which you can test whether a social fact is a fact or a mistake in reasoning. All right, so 3 ways to check social facts. Here is the first one. How do we tell bad social facts from good social facts? Now, you've all heard, I think, about philosophy of science. You've heard about Karl Popper, perhaps, who has his own way of thinking about mistakes in social science. Here's the advice that he would give. He would say, make sure your social science is falsifiable. All right, what does that mean? Well, in Karl Popper's case, a lot of people encounter him in their first philosophy of science because of his arguments about natural science. Because they have to study falsification and they think, such a drag, right? And I'm sure that there are people here who feel that way. But actually, Karl Popper wasn't just thinking about natural science. He was actually responding to other areas of science in his day, including Freudian psychology. So, this is his reasoning. Freudian psychology is not falsifiable. Why is it not falsifiable? What is going wrong there? Well, Freud can explain anything that happens. If you come to Freud with a case study of someone, I don't know, having some experiences in their childhood, no matter how this person responds to those experiences now, Freud will have an explanation. So it doesn't matter, right, what you observe. It is always going to be compatible with Mr. Freud's theory. And for that reason, Popper has likened that to horoscopes. He says Freudian psychology is just the same as astrology. There's no difference between these two things. Right? That is what he meant by falsifiable. He said anything, any observation will fit the theory. Here we go. It's possible to refute it through making observations, then it's good science. If it isn't, then really. And of course there are some slight sophistications you can bring to Popper's theory, but for everyday life, when we are looking at, say, a Brexiteer's reasoning about the referendum, you can use this to think, hey, would this be falsifiable? Would it be possible to observe something going on in the social world that would go against this person's argument in the first place? Or is that not possible? Are they going to flip-flop whatever the observation is and say that it fits with what they predicted? All right. So that's number one. Let's go to the second guide to checking for good social facts. Right? The second one is any piece of reasoning is always going to be based on two pieces of evidence, if it is good. Right? The first is it has worked somewhere else. Right? So let's think of an example. Smaller classrooms in primary schools in the Netherlands will bring up grades, right? Might be an argument you've heard, right? If this piece of reasoning is correct, right? If we want to show it's correct, we are usually going to base it on two things. One, a study somewhere else. So, for instance, a study of primary schools in Germany. And then we're going to make some kind of reasoning for why that piece of evidence in the other situation is applicable in our case. Right? And this goes wrong all the time. Why? For example, a lot of our policy in political science, in our educational research is based on research from somewhere else that is not automatically transportable to our situation. We aren't always basing it on primary schools in Germany. Sometimes we're basing these results on secondary schools in Hong Kong. Right? And we're saying, oh, well, it worked there, it must work here as well. And we can see why that would be mistaken. So that's my second piece of advice. Not only does a social prediction or a social theory need to be falsifiable, but also, on top of that, we want to know that whatever evidence we have of an experiment somewhere else is actually applicable in our new case. So not only has it worked somewhere else, but it is also workable here. Right. Our last one, and this is more recent, especially in, say, political science. This is a piece of reasoning where I've done academic research as well. You can look up the papers on this. A good social fact is not just about the numbers, right? It is more than just correlation. A lot of people tended, in political science especially, to put their faith into large N research, right? What does this mean? For example, you have the correlates of war database. Every single war in the past 60 years is in this database, as well as all kinds of interesting facts about the country in which this war occurred, the opponents, etc., etc. This then leads to certain correlations. For example, you can find a correlation between economic inequality and civil war. From that, people conclude that there is a causal relation between the two. And as I think a lot of people already thought earlier in this talk, correlation and causation are not the same thing. So, how do we go from correlation to causation? And that is the third piece of advice that I have. The best mark for a correlation that implies causation is that someone has traced exactly what the steps are from, say, economic inequality in one country to the outcome of civil war. Right? Have they traced this mechanism, this history, or haven't they? Are they just basing themselves on numbers? And again, there you can see that we might have to be a little more skeptical about social facts, because this hardly ever occurs. And even when it occurs, when we say, look at a process in Argentina between democratization on the one hand, economic inequality on the other, that doesn't mean that it applies somewhere else. That doesn't mean that it will apply in an Asian country or in a European country. So here you can see that these three guides, these three rules that I've given you, are actually really, really strict. And that we are, in many cases, dealing with very uncertain social facts. All right, so to sum up what I've talked about today, there are three pieces of interesting analysis that you can do when you're trying to spot mistakes in reasoning. The first is the pattern okay? Right? Does the pattern work? Can I use this pattern elsewhere? Can I see a similar pattern occurring in my everyday life where this pattern doesn't work? The second is, are these premises, are these reasons for our conclusion based on good observation? Are they based on solid reasoning? Or are they based on self-trumpeting, for example? And the last, when we're dealing with social facts, do these social facts meet the 3 guidelines that I've given you? So are they falsifiable? Are they based on a falsifiable theory? Are they based on a distinction between, on the one hand, correlation and on the other hand, causation? And finally, are they the result of somehow transporting research done elsewhere into a situation that is not matching the original situation? Those are my guidelines to you. I think we have some time at the end for some questions. So looking forward to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Our live stream operates on a slight delay, so while all the imps and gremlins are working away in the background and we wait for questions to appear, maybe there are some questions in the hall. Who would like to go first? So if you tell me your question, I will repeat it into the microphone and I will keep a distance. Right, so the question is, looking back at the ad hominem fallacy and the case of Mr. Trump, given the fact that he has told so many lies, might it not be sensible to assume that he might be telling another one?
Sure. So let's liken this to the instance of white swans and black swans, right? So all of the lies that Mr. Trump has told so far are your white swans. And so far we've only observed white swans, we've only observed lies. Then yes, there is something to say for making this general argument that if Trump says it, it must be a lie. Right? On the other hand, we can't say that with certainty. So like you are arguing here, it is probable, but it is not certain. And in that case, your black swan, your final truth from Mr. Trump, right? It is indeed possible that we are going to somehow falsify our general idea. So here it all links together, I think. And of course we did find black swans. Just like here we've finally found a piece of reasoning that was actually not completely wrong, right? And that's always going to happen, I think. So being skeptical means that even though something is highly probable, we leave room in our mental reasoning for the possibility that this time it might be different.
Thank you. Meanwhile, a question has appeared behind you, so perhaps if you can read it out. I haven't checked
How do you
it
correctly
yet.
address an opposing party's fallacies in a public speaking event? That depends. Do you do it at the public speaking event itself? Would I recommend this? This depends on whether this is a Trump rally or not, right? I wouldn't do that there. I have some kind of self-preservation there. On the other hand, I think that when we are addressing mistakes in reasoning, it depends, again, is this based on bad social facts, right? Is this based on, say, an ad hominem or self-trumpeting or something like that? Or finally, is it a mistake in the pattern? Pedagogically, I can tell you now that speaking at an event like that, if you start talking about the pattern of reasoning and start bringing in, but this is similar to the time when people argued about white swans, for example, right? People won't follow that and they won't like it. So perhaps in that case, I would leave it to slightly later in the discussion. On the other hand, if it's based on bad social facts, great, lay it out there. Say, listen, your reasoning is based on schools in Hong Kong. Have you realized that schools in Hong Kong also have these factors bringing up their grades? Why aren't we focusing on those? Why are you so certain that it's the class size that matters here? I want to know that before I spend money on this or that, right? So tell them exactly what it is, what is going wrong in one particular piece of social research. rather than saying your pattern is mistaken, which makes you sound like a falcon, and that I don't think is very helpful at a public speaking event. All right, let's have a look at some more questions.
Are there any further questions in the hall? Yes.
What are, in your opinion, the most common mistakes? And is this very bad?
Is it bad that
So the
there are
question,
mistakes?
just to repeat, what in your opinion are the most common mistakes? And
Yeah.
would you say that that is indeed bad?
So what I've shown you, the lovely if A then B is not equal to, if not A then not B, that's a really good example of something that happens a lot, right? We've seen that only 25% of people, and indeed in this audience at the live stream, obviously, you all got it right, I know that. In the live stream, there are people as well who can't do that bit of reasoning. What is going wrong is that people are notoriously bad at abstract patterns of reasoning, especially when it involves an implication, right? An if-then statement. If-then statements confuse people. Why does it confuse people? For that, I refer you to the Playful Brain, right? Where they try to give some kind of reasoning for why this might be the case. But again, that is to some extent social research, and as we know, we need to be a bit skeptical about that. Is it bad that people can't do this? Yes, it is. Of course it is. That's why you're here, right? You want to learn how to do this better. Yes, it's bad. That's my argument.
While we wait for more questions from the live stream, any further questions down here? Yes, thank you. So not so much a question, but an observation. When we read about arguments in articles, newspapers, and the news, we often do not get given the full picture. So it is difficult to assess their quality, if I interpret your question correctly. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much. That's a really good observation. So one of the things that I haven't talked about today are hidden premises, right? Someone is drawing a conclusion based on certain pieces of information with which they are trying to convince you, leaving out certain other premises or certain other reasons that they themselves have had for accepting the conclusion. People don't tell you the whole story. And by looking at the pattern of reasoning, you can find out whether there was a hidden premise, right? If you are being as generous as possible to your opponent, you are going to say to yourself, listen, I will assume that you are not making a mistake in the pattern here. I will assume that you're doing this to the best of your ability. Let's see what other premise we need in this argument to make it valid, right? To make the pattern work. And that is being as generous as possible, right? So on a positive note. That's why even in the case of the newspaper article that we saw earlier in this talk, you need to start looking beyond, right? Beyond just what you're given. And that's a really good observation. Thank you.
Any final questions? Yes.
The gentleman over here asked the question, is it bad? And you said yes. Of course it is. Could you maybe, back that up a bit more?
So the question is in regards to an earlier question about how bad it is that some people make certain logical mistakes. Could you elaborate?
Sure. Okay. So the mistake that we were talking about there is that people are finding it very difficult to reason about if-then statements, right? Implications. And we've seen one result, which is that people started to talk to the adult to ask them what they were drinking, right? This is a very simple example. And in this case, I'm sure that in the end we wouldn't fine the adult for drinking a water. Right? But there are more serious situations where having this problem with if-then statements can lead to real problematic results. Now, in the example, we are only dealing with a very simple scenario where policing, for instance, is only limited to this little pub where I'm sure the police are doing the best they can. However, there are other situations where people are using if-then statements that can be more problematic. I will leave it at that. I invite you to think of other if-then statements that people are generally making in the news, in policing, in, say, political arenas, where the if-then statement will be more damaging if it is wrongly interpreted. Right? And that happens a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa. It's time for us to finish there. As I mentioned, this is the first event in a series on spotting bullshit. Today we covered logical fallacies. In future events we're going to take a look at fake news, troll armies online, social media manipulation, deep fakes. So have a look on our website for the upcoming events. The first event that is coming up, you can see on the screen behind me next week. We're inviting Leiden here in the auditorium. So yes, do sign up if you can. With that, thank you all for coming. Thank you for the 40 odd people on the live stream. That's really good to see so many people joining us from home. Please leave in an orderly fashion, but most importantly, a big thank you to Rosa Runhardt.
Thank you.